Is the refugee situation a Bologna reform stress test? Is it a test of the systems of recognition of prior learning? To answer that question, I welcome 4 guests to enter the stage and to sit down in the comfortable chairs here. I welcome Michal Gaebel, Director for Higher Education Policy Unit at EURASHE, Blazhe Todorovski, Vice President at ESU, Mette Mørk Andersen from the European Commission, Michal Karpíšek, Secretary General at EURASHE. Welcome. You're all welcome to this conference and to this discussion. You will now have the opportunity to elaborate on the topic for this discussion, and you will be given 12 minutes each to have 1 introductory speech each. After that, we will raise questions from the audience, and you will have the opportunity to comment on each other. So, Michal Gaebel, you're the first one. Welcome.
I can take them off first.
Okay.
Anders will help you with the slides.
Yes, thanks. Good. Yeah, it's afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Not sure we had such an early lunch. I'm from the European University Association, and normally I start my presentations with slides of the European map and show where we have members everywhere. And I thought, I'm here in Sweden, I can skip that because all the universities are members of EUA. So I go right into the issue. Is the refugee issue, is that a stress test for Bologna? And we heard already a bit from David what is done in the Bologna process in terms of data collection and the reflection on some of the Bologna policies and tools. We heard also from Anders what has been put in the communique, and he was absolutely right to spot that, as David showed. RPL, it has been committed more than a decade ago, but we haven't seen so much progress. What the European ministers in 2015 also committed to was that they said explicitly, we will provide mobility opportunities for students and staff from conflict areas while working to make it possible for them to return home once conditions allow. This has been said there. I'm not sure if we have seen so much follow-up on this in our, not daily, but in our regular work in the Bologna follow-up group. And I say that pointing with fingers at colleagues and as myself, because I'm in the BFUG. We have addressed it implicitly, I think, in one of the working groups of the BFUG on new goals, where we talked, chaired by, among others, by Sweden, where we talked about new learners and about how to make systems more inclusive for ethnic minorities, demographic changes, migrants, and that the EHEA would need a response to demographic changes and to immigration. So you could say there was some goodwill. We didn't probably get that far with that. We can discuss later on what were the reasons for that. What I wanted to do next is actually to point a little bit about, and David has already pointed to that, about what we are actually looking at, the realities when we are speaking about refugees, asylum seekers. So this is the picture that you all know, 2015-16, 1.3 million, mainly to Germany and to Sweden. But then the other issue is also, this is not the full picture because we have, of course, other forms of migration. So, and what we can see when you look at the discussions in the media, I think there is very little awareness that we have about 1.4 million third country nationals coming to the European Union every year. And the reasons for this is family, marriage, and also students. So this is excluding asylum seekers. People usually don't know about it. They speak about refugees, and I think it's connected to a certain idea of refugees. They are poor, they are disadvantaged, they probably have no education, and it's associated with a problem. And I think it has also to do with the general attitude that we have usually towards migrants, only that there is much, without having much reflection on that and much public debate. The other issue that has also been mentioned, we also have the intra-European Union migration, and it's actually welcomed. This is at the heart of the European Union, mobility of people for work, for study. If you look at the statistics, actually, you find out that the asylum seekers are the smallest part of the migration that we actually have to face. So I pointed that here for the EU average with the red arrow. It's this little dark gray segment, which is probably 3% of the total migration in 2005, 2013. And then at the case of Sweden, where you can see that Sweden had a relatively, with a blue arrow, where you can see that Sweden had a relatively high amount of humanitarian migrants, so refugees, asylum seekers. All the rest, as mentioned, is regular immigration for work, family, marriage, and others, which also includes students. So this is just to say that this is probably something we have to get more knowledgeable about, and which we should include, of course, not only in our thinking of how we build our education systems, but they have also be considered in education. I'm moving on and show you a bit what universities have been doing. In 2015, when the so-called refugee crisis started, we at EUA, we didn't quite know, well, we had the feeling we had to do something, but we didn't know quite what. So we thought, let's try to find out what is actually happening on the ground. And we established this, what we called the Refugees Welcome Map. It's at the heart is a small survey that institutions and organizations can fill, and then we make the initiatives visible on this interactive map. You can click it. It is, can I see that here? Yeah, it is searchable, so you can find out about what are institutions doing. And this was, so to say, the first step to get an idea. And when we are looking now from 2015 to 2017, what has happened, I think there are some interesting observations. The first thing is that we can compare the 2015, 2017, that there were very different situations. In 2015, we were surprised that and we heard this just from the rector from Malmö University, about the enthusiasm, the sudden enthusiastic response that people engaged for refugees. And a lot of the activities that we saw, they didn't come from presidents or vice chancellors, they were bottom up, they came from students and individual staff. And interestingly, they also occurred in countries where the regimes were not so welcoming to refugees. So you could really say it's all over Europe. 2015-16, this was clearly a first aid agenda. It targeted refugees at large for shelter, food, health, language support, helping them with the authorities, organized cultural meetings, sports, and a bit of education, mainly language and welcome courses. It also provided courses for domestic population, which had to learn of how to help refugees and how to work with them. This changed then in 2016-17, where we saw that universities are taking now much more a focus on students and scholars. So it addresses recognition, yes. People without papers, yes, as well. Recognition of prior learning, RPL, we hear that occasionally, but actually not so much. It is not mentioned as a predominant issue at most of the universities. I think that has to do with the fact that some countries have no recognition of prior learning, as David just showed us. But it also has to do that some institutions, in some countries, institutions may not need it, and they can just decide whom they admit to higher education. We also, I should say, have cases where institutions responded that they use RPL though we know that there is no RPL at the systems level, so they must have made it up. But another reason, I think, why it is not used so often is that there might be, or not so often mentioned, that there might also be other issues to be addressed. And one of them is clearly access and admission, which is very complicated. Anders has pointed to it already. It has to do also with the status of the refugees. We thought in the very beginning that must be very easy. We just try to find out what are the different rules in the different countries, but it turned out to be actually much more complicated, also because in some countries there are devolved regimes for this. So it's actually quite complicated to get an overview on that. And there's also some uncertainty at institutions, or at least it was there in 2016, 17, beginning 17, when we surveyed them. There is also sometimes the problem that they are caught between different selection regimes. So regimes for domestic students and those for international, and that none of those is very favorable for migrant students. And then, of course, also this has already been mentioned in first instance, there are other issues to be addressed in order to get people ready for university, and these are language courses and often also preparation and bridging courses, which we could see basically are done at about every university. And beyond that, there is also the issue of career guidance, because a lot of the students arrive, or potential students, they arrive with relatively clear ideas what they want to study, and it's with high likelihood it's medicine, economics, or law, and they need more information and need to be advised about the wider possibilities that they could have, probably possibilities they never have thought about in their home country, but which may matter for them, whether they stay here in Europe, go back to their home country, or move elsewhere. So it's career guidance regarding higher education, regarding different types of higher education, but probably also regarding other learning and training paths outside of tertiary education. What we also see very little on the map, which has been an issue in the media, is alternative provision via on and e-learning. So I don't say that it is not used by institutions, but it's not a main means, and we will hear this afternoon from our colleagues from Chiron, who will fill us in a bit more about what are the issues there. It's not very widespread at this moment. If I look then more at the higher education institution and compare a bit from the different responses that we get from institutions, you can clearly see some enabling factors. One is clearly institutional strategies, and I do not mean necessarily strategies for refugees. Some institutions have started to develop them, but just the fact that there is a social inclusion strategy, that there is a strategy for internationalization, a strategy for learning and teaching that can help to get a discussion on how to deal with refugees going. Another point is clearly that we can see the differences between universities which have resources and funding for that and others which don't or have that very limited. I think in the early days, this didn't play so much a role because everybody was enthusiastic. There was a lot of volunteering there, but now things are getting more serious, and you have to establish robust processes and robust support. And so there's clearly an advantage for institutions which are better resourced, and in particular those who can rely on national support mechanisms, not only for funding, but also for sharing experience and for exchanging good practices. What we can also see that almost all institutions reach out and try to collaborate. It's with other higher education institutions, with governmental or non-governmental institutions. And this is also because the task is actually much larger than just bringing young people into higher education. It has to do with integration. in many places they also try to contribute to local and national strategies and policies for the refugees. And I think a very interesting observation, many institutions in their submissions refer to transferability of prior experience that they had. So they said, we did things for lifelong learning and we can actually adapt them now when we work with the refugees. Similarly, experience from international offices and social inclusion work that they did with other disadvantaged groups. One issue probably which might happen and which would actually be good to see, and I think in some institutions that is probably already on the way, that they look at it not only in one particular part of the things that they do in one of their missions, but that they really look at this across the missions. So you could say it concerns all three missions. Research and research dissemination, I think, is very important to get better information and to get a more differentiated debate on the issue, and also to make sure that systems are politically and socially better prepared. Then for learning and teaching, it could be seen as a kind of litmus test for learning and teaching for a differentiated international classroom and social inclusion. Third mission, it's evidently an opportunity for outreach to society, for students and staff, and it's used by many institutions. And I think the last point that I wanted to mention here is internationalization, which is a bit of a, you could say there's almost a paradox giving the sometimes hostile attitude that we feel towards, and the worries that we feel towards refugees. But on the other hand, you hardly find anybody who is against internationalization and against bringing foreign students and staff in. So I think it's probably up for debate who is actually an international student and staff. And if you look closer, even if you don't target refugees, you may have refugees already at your institution, people who escaped war in their countries and came in as international students and researchers. And the second point here is, which is addressed by a small group of universities so far as we can see, is also the question, is there a kind of global mission? Have we to put to bring higher education to refugee camps? When I heard that for the first time, I couldn't quite think that that would make sense, but I think I'm in the process of changing my views here. On the first point, I think that gave also reason for us to come up with one recommendation for the ongoing Erasmus midterm review. And we proposed to the Commission to have student grants for a full study for refugee students and also fellowships for university staff. We have been talking a lot about students, but there is also an issue about university staff. And in particular, over the recent months, we have got so many university staff who had to leave Turkey, for example, and to seek refuge in Europe and elsewhere. The other point is the access to higher education. And if you look at a report that the UNHCR brought out in 2016, they make the point here that only 1% of refugees have access to higher education. So it's about half of the refugees which have access to primary education. It's about 1/5 which has access to secondary education. But if it comes to higher education, it's actually only 1% compared to 34% in world average, you could say. And as you know, Europe is not among the top hosting countries. Most of the refugees stay outside of Europe. So I think that makes quite a point for considering how to make sure that also in those countries they get access to higher education.
Michal, you can see that I'm getting closer and closer now.
I'm sorry, no, I didn't see that. Yeah,
so when I have approached you, I will take your microphone.
Okay,
you know?
then I still have enough room for this slide.
Okay. 1 minute.
So actually, I wanted to conclude here and to say, so this was a bit the institutional perspective, bringing this back now to the Bologna process and where it stands and what it does. And I think the process is actually, if you want so, is in a kind of a pole position, because it did many of the things that are actually required when you want to take in foreign country nationals who come from different systems. So I think the fact to have a converged and transparent systems in Europe which are to serve diverse societies, this is actually a good starting point to take in migrants from wherever they come and for whatever reasons they come. And there is a clear focus on flexibility, recognition, quality assurance, mobility, social inclusion. A question is probably how we deal with this whole global dimension and internationalization that I addressed on the previous slide, which looks a little bit foreign to us. But on the other hand, it doesn't really make sense to talk about global outreach in research and seeing there a global mission of the university, but then saying the whole social responsibility of the university that ends at the national borders or ends at the European borders. Why should it? And if you ask how that could actually be done, I mean, it is already done. As I mentioned, there are some universities, also universities from Sweden, active in that area. But actually, the domain is currently dominated by private for-profits, which do not always do a very good job and which are also probably provide an education which doesn't get the recognition and the credentials that it would require to be really useful for the refugees. So that's, I think, my last point. Should we also think about what actually internationalization means nowadays? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. A warm applause. Michael Gaebel, please have a seat. And now, maybe more out of a student perspective, Blazhe Todorovski, Vice President for ESU, is the refugee situation a stress test of the systems of recognition of prior learning. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I will just briefly, in one sentence, present our organization. So, the European Students' Union is an umbrella organization representing 45 national union of students from 38 countries from countries from the European higher education area, due to the fact that sometimes we are just mixed with that we are representing the EU countries only, which is not really the case. I will start my presentation with part of our policy paper, where we are actually mentioning the quality, the recognition of, in our quality policy paper, which we are mentioning the part of the recognition of prior learning, and which is not only focused on students, refugees, but general students. And ESU states that students should have the possibility their prior learning to be recognized independently of how it was achieved, even if they do not have formally certified qualifications, providing access to a certain educational program. I mean, this is very relevant due to the fact that on this one we are also basing our policy and work also, especially in the last 2 years, on recognition of refugee qualifications, but also integration of refugees into the societies through 2 of our main projects in ESU at the moment. When it comes to the refugees, but also with displaced person and asylum seekers without refugee status, because this group is more broader than the group of refugee, as Michal already mentioned, we believe that the refugees and all displaced persons and the asylum seekers without refugee status with prior education or training, whether that has been formal, informal, or non-formal, should have the right to have their qualification assessed and recognized in a fair and transparent way in line with the Lisbon Recognition Convention. We do believe that through the Lisbon Recognition Convention, as it's been already mentioned, and especially in the last implementation report, where we have Chapter 5 on the refugee qualifications, we can see that out of 50 countries that answered the survey, we have 15 that have sort of regulated, but 35 is not regulated procedures for recognition of refugees, which is, in our perspective, quite worrying. However, through to the survey and a project that we've done, and the last publications from ESO that was published a month ago, the Refugees Welcome, where we have a country analysis of 4 countries regarding recognition of the refugee qualifications and the obstacles. One of the main obstacles that are also mentioned here, but also in the implementation report and in other studies, are the the obstacles that are faced, the refugees are faced, are mainly the lack of the procedures in the countries. As following on the lack of procedures is the lack of the knowledge of the language and accessibility to the procedures available in different languages, especially for the asylum seekers and the refugees. Then the lack of documentations that are these people are holding, usually because we know that these people are sometimes coming from countries that are at war in the moment and leaving the country. Not everybody is trying to take their diploma and all the documents that are proving their qualifications, but mainly it's saving their lives and getting out on safety. Also, it's the lack of comparability of qualifications gained, and last but not least, maybe even the biggest obstacle is the bureaucracy in certain countries of recognizing the qualifications. When it comes to the, well, shortly, ESO's standpoint is on, especially on these obstacles and how they should be tackled. We believe that there should be national regulations, as it's also already recommended. However, it's not that much followed up in a lot of countries. Is setting up certain regulations, both on national level, and this procedure should be fair, and the people seeking for the recognition of the prior learning and recognition of qualifications gained before should should tackle the obstacles and the main obstacles that we mentioned, and also should be more accessible and user-friendly in a way. Last but not least, we do believe that access to higher education for refugees is a crucial condition for inclusion of displaced people, refugees, and supporting social mobility, providing access to skills and competencies for the world of work, but also for active participation in the society that this group of people can gain through to the recognition of prior learning, recognition of qualifications. One of the worrying parts, and that were also mentioned, especially what can, because this is also the question, what can Bologna do and what can be done up front and also within the working group 3. Well, when we go back again to the implementation report, we should first ask ourselves it's not the question what should we do or what the ministers in the next communique should oblige to do. There are plenty of regulations and documents that are set and are in place, but they are not implemented in the countries. And that is kind of the first problem that I believe that all the countries in the European higher education area should tackle with. Of course, putting more emphasis in the forthcoming ministerial communique through the working group 3, but not only through the working group 3, but also through the countries implementing and working on the commitments that they have already agreed on in the past 15 years until now, should be the first step of moving forward. Because with having these key commitments implemented, will give more successful way to move forward and integrate both refugees, asylum seekers, displaced persons, and onwards. So, I mean, briefly, I will not take the floor more, because I do agree that most likely we will all be sort of agreeing with this topic within the 4 speakers, but we might have contradicting questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You will come back to the table to answer questions and give comments later on?
Yes, of course.
If you want some water, you can have some water, of course. Next person to have an introductory speech to this discussion is Mette Andersen from the European Commission. You are welcome, and you are also here to answer the question, is the refugee situation a Bologna reform stress test and a stress test of the systems of recognition of prior learning? Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also for inviting me to this conference and to Malmö Högskola. We've had the pleasure of having Patricia's staff come and visit us several times in Brussels, so I'm very happy to come and visit you now. Patricia has a very special place in our heart in the little policy unit that I work in, because when we look at the question of social inclusion, how to attract talent where talent is, and really engage in the local community, this university has managed to do remarkable things, and it's not at the cost of quality, which is sometimes a concern you hear. So the next time I do hear someone say that a more diverse student body means lower quality in higher education, I'll have them call Patricia. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy also to be part of discussing this question whether refugees have an impact on Bologna reforms, and I'm very happy that it's asked in that order, this question. Of course, from my point of view, the answer is yes, because it's very much part of a broader agenda, one that we do need to promote even better, and all the reasons why David presented earlier on. So we need to be able to absorb talent where talent is in higher education, and clearly we need to think more outside the box, because when it comes to social mobility, there are still many countries that do not fare as well as they should, and also countries here in the north where let's say all support measures are in place, we still see that your personal background, the education level of your parents, seem to matter more than what the system is able to address at the moment. So from my part, I think the answer is definitely yes. This is an opportunity to look at how we in higher education can welcome people who come with perhaps different documents that we're used to, but also who have studied in institutions that we are less familiar with, or who have not gone, say, the straight road into higher education. So what I would like to do is to build on what has been said already and look at the opportunities we have then for trying to address recognition of prior learning a bit better, and to look at some parallels between what we have seen over the last few years in the wake of a lot of people coming to Europe requesting asylum, and whether we can perhaps explore these parallels a bit better from now on. So since 2015, what we did from a European perspective was to, well, first try and gather an overview of what was the need and what were the immediate responses in countries in the EU to, well, this 1.3 million people coming to seek international protection. And as Michal already mentioned, we saw a lot of activities. We saw a lot of individual or single-standing initiatives merge. What we, of course, also saw that has been mentioned by both David and Michal before is that two countries had their arms, let's say, a bit more open than many other countries, which, of course, Germany and Sweden. And the question of recognition became very immediate in especially Germany and Sweden, but also in other countries. And we saw that we had tools in place in the countries that were activated. So I know that there will be a presentation of the TESTA system in Germany, and also the background document that has been introduced in the Netherlands, amongst other countries. And it was really things that were in place already, but were relevant to activate or to support a bit more in these times. So didn't have to invent a deep plate. It was already in place. It was simply about pushing more for the implementation of it, or using tools that were meant for a different target group, but for refugees. We also saw that, well, we had different figures emerging, but 10 to 20% in the beginning were estimated to have a higher education qualification, or partly a degree from higher education. We know now that in other countries, and also in Germany and Sweden, those figures have been decreased a little bit. But nonetheless, the question, of course, remains pertinent. We saw other countries follow the sort of same approach. We saw that this concept of a background document, where you try to collect the evidence that's possible to collect to prove a certain qualification, was used in a handful of countries, and some new measures were put in place as well for that. Engagement with NGOs that are responsible for receiving asylum seekers was also activated more. So we saw positive, mainly single-standing initiatives spread, but in, let's say, 2 handful of countries. Then we learned the lesson that there was existing tools in place. We had tools in place in certain countries that could easily be spread and promoted to other countries. But we had to also, and with this conference, we have to ask the question, can we then also see these tools spread to a wider target group? And there I already said that it is pertinent that they are absolutely seen as part of a much wider context as well, which is the context of the social inclusion in higher education. We recently held a PLA in Brussels. It was on the issue of academic recognition, and we had invited recognition centers from 10 countries, mainly EU countries, but Armenia and Norway were also there, to talk about the initiatives that exist in the field. And what we learned, and the conclusions that were drawn at the end of this PLA, was that institutional engagement is absolutely crucial in this question. So it's very pleasant to see so many institutions here today. We found out that, and it's been mentioned already, also by Blazhe, that European tools exist. We just need to make better use of them. For instance, there is the ECTS Users Guide from 2015. It was, well, it feels like it's just recently, but maybe not so much anymore. In 2015, ministers of the Bologna process, they adopted the new ECTS Users Guide. And one of the new elements in that guide is recognition of prior learning, also from a non-formal and informal context. It speaks about how you should create a portfolio of documents, portfolio that proves what sort of learning a potential student has gone through. And when you then look at what is asked in the procedures, when you have a background document in the countries that have that, it's sort of the same. You know, it's collecting evidence of the prior learning of a student, even if there is no diploma, official diploma certifying that learning. So we see that there are parallels to be drawn, and that the ECTS Users Guide, in that sense, already sort of give guidelines to how ECTS can be promoted for learning that has taken place outside of higher education institutions. It's something we think in the Commission is going to be more and more relevant for higher education, also to ensure that qualifications, that the graduates with the qualifications can respond directly to the challenges, the demands, and the opportunities that the society and labor market will greet them with after graduation. Another conclusion we drew at that PLA is that raising awareness of education opportunities in the initial phase, arrival phase, is essential. But there we have to differentiate between 2 arrival phases, because we had invited also stakeholders from the education community and from migration authorities and NGOs. And the Danish Refugee Council in Greece, they said, in the initial phase, of course, it's less relevant to start guiding about education opportunities because it's very much about shelter, food, how to move further to the country that people wish to settle in. So when we speak about the initial phase for providing information about the education system, it's either when people arrive to the country that they would like to settle in, or if the transition period is longer than 6 months. And no matter what, they underlined that any activities have to be together with the local environment. To have activities isolated in refugee centers or in some sort of camp makes no sense for the individual or society. And we saw many good examples then of initiatives in countries. We saw that in the Netherlands, for instance, they have put in place already a toolkit on how to welcome people into higher education, inform them about what is required. They have even developed an app, the same has Germany. Denmark has a hotline that you can call with questions, and Finland has introduced targeted counseling. In France, all higher education institutions are to have a migrant reference, they call it. So there are many good initiatives. But what was also requested by the participants was that there needs to be some national approaches to this. It has to have support from a political level. And the ironic part at the moment was that political attention seems to be decreasing when the request for recognition and access to higher education is actually increasing. One initiative, or one thing that many countries requested but had not put in place yet, was a network between relevant stakeholders, so between higher education institutions, admission officers, between ministries that are responsible for both education but also migration issues, for NGOs that are often responsible for welcoming people, for taking care of the reception centers in countries. A network like that does exist in the Netherlands, but many countries that do have good practice do not have this network yet. And when we then look at what is recommended when it comes to recognition of prior learning, it's exactly the same thing. It's to establish a network with practitioners, between the institutions and education authorities. So again, we have a reason why the refugees' impact on, for instance, addressing recognition of prior learning. We can see that there are parallels to draw on. We can see that some of the same activities some of the activities requested are indeed the same. All right, I want to show you two things that we have done in the Commission through what we had available to support refugees arriving. And when I say refugees, it's only to save myself from time, because of course in this I include asylum seekers as well. It's different from country to country who has access to which services. So it's for the sake of simplification, I will now say refugees. So we had, with the new Erasmus Plus program, introduced something called the Online Linguistic Support, the OLS. And this is a test for students who wish to be mobile on the Erasmus to see, okay, at what sort of level is their linguistic skills for the country that they are requiring mobility to. Started out with a handful of the bigger languages, but now it has spread to 18 different languages. And we saw that one of the immediate challenges for access to higher education is, of course, that you have some sort of prior qualification at the level of what is required at national level, but it's also very much a question of the language that you have, because many countries do request that you have a certain level of the language or languages spoken in a given country where you want to attend higher education. So we spread this tool we had, and we established last year the OLS for refugees. And with that, we issued 100,000 licenses that can be requested by refugees. And they have to request these through the organizations and the institutions that already have these licenses on the Erasmus+. So that could be your national agencies, it can be higher education institutions, it can be youth organizations. And now we're also promoting this tool to NGOs so that they can help refugees to apply for a license. And what it is, first of all, it's testing your linguistic skills, but it's also providing you one-on-one mentoring, online, of course. It's a very good complement to the language courses that refugees, they often have access to, or they have to have access to when they receive the status. And there's tutorial built into this and some testing. And so far, 50,000 licenses have been requested. So that's very, very good progress. We have 5,000 refugees that have completed this OLS, and some of them have absolutely remarkable results. They learn a language fluently within three months. And on average, we can see that refugees, they spend more time than the regular Erasmus students on this. So we know that the motivation is there. Another thing we, of course, looked at immediately was for access to higher education, you need to have some... I see you moving closer, Tobias. Out of the corner of my eye, I see you. This is my last slide. Perfect. Out of the 3 I brought. But what we did was we had, around that time, we had a call on the Erasmus Plus for the academic recognition centers. And we simply prioritized access to higher education for refugees through this call. And it is currently funding a project. It's a project that a handful of NARIC centers are developing. The project leader is the Norwegian center, so if you want a lot more information later, Joachim is here. He can help you there in the middle. But what we want to build is a toolkit that is valuable for credential evaluators, in the NARIC centers, of course, but very much also in the higher education institutions. And there is also material that you can spread to any NGOs or any organization responsible for reception of refugees. It will consist of some guidelines, how to deal with recognition, both of documented and undocumented qualifications. It will have an e-learning module, so that you can train online. It will have examples of background documents for undocumented qualifications, 2 different versions of these, depending on what suits your national system the best, and information on education systems with good tips and tricks on what to do and what to take into consideration in these cases. So we also started, like Michal mentioned, by looking at what do we have, what can we activate right now. But of course, well, from where we go now, both when it comes to recognition of prior learning for refugees, but also in general for students, we need to look at a more streamlined approach. And with the portfolio that is described in the ECTS Users Guide, with the guidelines that we have in place under the recommendation from 2012. It's guidelines that are very similar to the EAR manual in higher education, and with the various background documents we find in some European countries, we definitely have a very solid starting point for trying to be, let's say, maybe even less rigid in what sort of prior learning we appreciate when people enter higher education. Thank you.
Thank you. Please have a seat and you can come back with comments in a bit. Michal, Karpíšek, you are obliged to answer the same question as the others. Is the refugee situation a stress test for the systems of recognition of prior learning and the Bologna process? Welcome.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you as well for inviting me to this event. I have to say that this is the first time I'm in Sweden, so I didn't dare to enter Sweden much more than crossing the bridge from Denmark and ending up in Malmö. But I believe that the next time I will be more courageous and discover other beauties of the country. When thinking about the theme and the event, I noticed that I will be the last one from the group. And I was thinking how one slide after another will disappear. And I will end up here with about 60 slides about EURASHE. And when Tobias will come, I'll be explaining to you how the board feeds into the agenda of the General Assembly. EURASHE is the representation of professionally oriented higher institutions across European higher education area. So I would focus much more on recognition of prior learning. I have to say that was my first response to Anders when they asked me to come, saying that we might see recognition of prior learning as something where we lag behind in development across Europe, that the refugees are probably quite helpful aspect to speed up or renew the discussion on sort of harmonizing the different approaches. But again, as Michal has already shown, there are a number of other groups which would benefit from further development of recognition of prior learning. And as we are coming from the sector which is really focused much strongly on skills and competencies, we see a huge potential of recognition of prior learning for enhancing our educational activities, especially as it was said for the lifelong learning. There will be a number of people who would benefit from shortening and efficient way through upskilling and reskilling when they can get recognize their skills. I have to say, Michal provided the European data. I'm coming from the Czech Republic, which is not seen probably as a very positive country when it comes to refugees. But I will show you some proportions why we would need that as well. I have to say that there are some registered refugees in the Czech lands, whatever you think. We have 12 people who have officially registered. I'm not commenting on that. However, there is about 80,000 people coming to the country every year, and they would come from different areas of post-Soviet countries, of Balkans, and they would have the same issue, recognizing what they have achieved, how they would integrate into the society. And then we have few million people who are working, and with all the discussion about the digitalization of the work, of new technologies, I think there will be huge potential for workforce, for people to get the new skills, ask for the new skills. At some moment, we were running in the Czech lands the survey, what would be the potential of professional tertiary education. And we came out with the estimate, there are no clear data, that the private businesses have spent something like equal volume of money like the higher education budget of the country on training, on retraining, and the schools have got only 0.5% of that sum. I think that there's a huge potential for our type of institutions to step in, and again, recognition of prior learning would make much more impact. So yes, the discussion on the refugees would be probably a very good driver to speed things up, but there are other motives behind that. As I said, EURASHE tried to pay attention to the agenda on long-term basis. We have run or organized few, at that time, Bologna seminars, one in 2008 in Amsterdam, and the next one in 2012 in Prague. I believe that some people who are here have attended that one in Prague. And what was a little bit frustrating, I would say, when I went through the conclusions from the Prague seminar in 2012, and I went through the challenges, saying that the countries lack trust. In many of them, there are no national policies. There's only limited information and lack of trust among the main stakeholders, especially higher education institutions and employers and potential applicants themselves. Some participants pointed out of dated education and training approaches, and that was not the time when we were speaking about changing the patterns of higher education and more flexibly that much. National qualification frameworks have not been implemented in a number of countries. This probably might have moved a little bit. The issue of assessing the knowledge, skills and competences has been quite a difficult issue for a number of the participants. How do we address that appropriate way? And the costs of recognition of prior learning. Who is paying? And I remember that the discussion in 2008 in Amsterdam showed that there are different approaches across Europe, putting the financial, I would not say the burden, the financial responsibility on different players within the triangle. If I remember, in France, it was with a huge contribution from the employers, whereas in some northwestern countries there was more sort of individual contribution. In some other countries, this was with the public. With public support. So I think there was a number of motives which also led to different approaches. And I'm not sure how much the debate has moved since on. I can understand that there have been developments within some countries, namely 5. But the discussion on harmonization and having something which would put more trust into the system, into links to quality assurance, have not moved very much on the European level, I'm afraid. And this is also why we were at some time ready to feed into the working group, should have it been established within the Bologna follow-up, within the Bologna process, which would focus on recognition of prior learning. This has not happened, and I'm not sure how much the working group on implementation has the capacity to focus on very specific issues, because they cover quite a wide range of areas. So I think that there's quite a potential for further discussion how to coordinate things on European level, and I would say that EURASHE would be again quite willing to contribute to that. That's probably all from my part at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, please enter the table, all of you. Gather around the table. There is a saying in Swedish. It sounds almost insane when we try to translate it, but it says, if you have room in your hearts, there is room also for your bottoms. So you have to squeeze together. And that's a topic for the dinner tonight to discuss. Do you have similar expressions in your countries? Let's start this discussion by addressing the audience. You will be given a question, and Anders, I think we can show the question. I think we have a slide for it. So grab your green and red notes in the audience. You do not have to grab your notes. You will be able to comment on this later on. So the question is, should there be European guidelines for recognition of prior learning specific for the higher education sector? Should there be European guidelines? Yes, a lot of greens. We have a couple of red ones, but it's a big majority of greens. But maybe we can make it even harder, the question. Right, Anders? We have another question. So it's almost the same, but now I want to ask you, should there be binding European guidelines for recognition of prior learning specific to the higher education sector? Okay, that's almost the opposite. Some green ones, but a lot of red ones. So, who wants to comment on this first? Michal?
Yeah, it just shows that everybody likes guidelines as long as they're not binding. Which is a bit one of the problems that we have in the Bologna process. Yeah. And increasingly we tried to address that. Probably there's always a debate between people who are more hardliners on these issues and others who are very soft. We try to find compromises, but I think over the recent years, just by the fact that the reporting has become better and that we address issues, and we have currently a group which is called non-implementation, which tries to make sure that all countries implement at least the minimum requirements that that they had committed to. I think that shows that this is necessary.
Yeah.
So
you would have a green note for the first question, but
I would give a green, because if they're not binding, what's it worth? So.
Okay, Blazhe, what do you say?
Yes. Well, following.
Sorry, if I can, they should be binding for countries and voluntary for institutions.
Okay.
Well,
now you can be re-elected. That's good.
It's good that it's my last panel as vice president of ESU, so even if I say something, I'm gone in 2 weeks.
Okay.
And then my successors can take the responsibility afterwards. No, just joking. Well, mentioning the advisory group 3, I mean, we have the 3 key commitments that and the cyclic procedure that is planned to start soon. And one of the 3 key commitments is basically the compliance with the Lisbon Recognition Convention. So I think that this is kind of sort of mechanism. Well, maybe not mechanism enough, but for the beginning, it's a mechanism that maybe will steer also country to work within the compliance of the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is strictly, and I mean, explains properly the recognition of prior learning, not only for refugees, but all general for students and for. So I don't know whether I should call it, I mean, I don't know whether I would raise a green card on it, because I believe that there is something already. The thing is that countries haven't implemented and compliant with it. So maybe I'll go with more red, and due to the fact I do agree that we have still the problem of we want to have guidelines, but if they're not binding and we don't, countries don't, or higher education institutions should not follow strictly. So I mean, we have the European standards and guidelines that it took quite some time for countries even to implement or to follow.
Mette, how would you comment on the question and the results from the audience?
Yeah, well, it doesn't surprise me what the results are. We have the recommendation, the Council recommendation for EU countries from 2012. Although I was on the other side, the side of member states back then when we negotiated it, I remember that that many countries did everything they could to postpone the deadline as much as possible without the whole recommendation falling. So I'm not surprised about the red signs that I saw right now. There are some beautifully written guidelines to follow that recommendation, and there you have a specific section relevant for higher education. If you put that together with the EUR manual, which is of course for credential evaluators, but it also addresses this issue, and the ECTS users guide, like I mentioned before, it's not that we are missing guidelines in this. What we are probably, what is a challenge for various reasons, is that whenever we speak about doing something that is not standard or having to introduce some measures that are not already in place, it requires resources. And at the same time, we also see constraints on the budget of higher education institutions the last years. So it requires an effort. I'm sure that there's plenty of goodwill, but yes, it would require a bit more, especially at institutional level. You can, as a country, you can introduce legislation, but that doesn't guarantee any success if it's not followed up with support to institutions for implementation. So I think we have the guidelines in place that we need. We can of course discuss revising them, but I would personally prefer to see us use what we have more actively than look at revision again, because then it's just once again bureaucrats talking to bureaucrats.
Blazhe, a short comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. I mean, as ESU representative and delegate, I'm not saying that when I said that I would go more for the green one, for the red one, was due to the fact that we have plenty of documents that countries and stakeholders should follow, but we are not following nor implementing them, and that's why in first place I said that I would, for example, raise the green one, because I understood this question of setting a working group, working and preparing new documents for something that we already have, but it's not implemented due to several factors.
Michal, you can also comment on this question. I just want to encourage you in the audience to raise your hands if you want to address the panel with a question or a comment.
Okay, well, just want to clarify the rules. Is this some sort of weakest link that the one who is wrong answer leaves the panel and...
No. You're welcome.
No, I agree that it's probably the matter of communication, sharing, and learning. The thing is, and I think we could have seen that from David's schemes, the division across European higher education is vast. And I think whatever you may agree in the green countries should have been adopted for the orange and red countries, and that would be probably quite a challenge for the future. And we can see that within the working group on non-implementation. At the same time, what I understood, and it remains there, is explaining how this is embedded into quality assurance system, so things would be reliable, not only for the academic community, but also for the external stakeholders and partners. And I think that this is not still very much clear.
We have a question from the audience. Please tell us who you are and raise a question.
Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mette was nice introducing me. It's Joachim Kallevik from the Norwegian Enik Agency and also the Quality Assurance Agency. Ambitions and statements and guidelines and attitudes is of course very positive, but unless we manage to convert it into actual actions, they're worthless for the broader society, for the individual's meeting system and everything. So I just wanted to follow up what Mette was saying and brag a bit about the toolkit process, which is very, very positive, because through that project, all the ambitions and guidelines that are already existing, as you pointed out, there are several of them, are converted into actual action. And we are now testing out various background papers. Right now I got an email from some colleagues who are down in Greece testing out the European qualifications passport for refugees, which is a recognition tool also for those who cannot provide any documents for the recognition purposes, standardized documents. So thank you very much for financing and supporting that work. Thank you.
Okay, so how do you comment on this? Do we need more action? How do you get more action? Michal?
I think we agree on the action, but I think that's exactly the process, the problem when you're in a voluntary process, which the Bologna process is. And I think it took a bit of discussion, and it's still an ongoing discussion in some respects, to make clear to people that the process as such is voluntary, but you cannot sign up to a voluntary process and then when you're in the process choose what you are implementing or not. So if you made the commitment, you should stick to that, and in this regards voluntary guidelines probably doesn't make much sense. And it's not so much to set a law here and so that you could go to the European Court of Justice and start a case against it. That would not be the issue. But I mean, clearly that governments see the commitment, and that David and his colleagues in the next round could put a red or orange or green field then in. And I think that's very close to what you said, put it into action. I think if you don't have it in place in a country and you feel it should be, and sometimes it's not because countries didn't want to implement it, but simply because there was no awareness raising to it, and you got away with that over so many years, then...
Let's pick up another question from the audience, yes.
Hello, my name is Adrian Iordache from the Romanian NARIC, and from your data that you have presented and also from the speaker's point of view, there is a little clash, you can find a little clash between what is done or the interest of the governments or even the institution on that, even with the internationalization that is a subject for everybody, and it was not applied for RPL. And this interest brought also by the migrants. And also the data shows that there is an important number in just some countries, and we talk about here implementing this in all the countries. So how can we find, or where can we find the arguments also for the political will and also for the universities to put their resources in implementing this if for their own national didn't work, for the internationalization didn't work, and now just for a few numbers of migrants, which are in some countries and not as many in others, will push forward this process. Thank you.
You can give the microphone to the gentleman in front of you. So we take another question.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you, everybody. My name is Majid Jafari, and I am a senior political refugee. And now I work with an academic immigrant. University of Borås. According to action, I think is not enough. I have general reflection and one question, and to David too. I think is not enough with the Bologna process or social engagement. We should expand the process, the important dimension, it means labor market. This is the key for our strategy, working place. So what I want to say, what is a strategy for EU to build the bridge between the higher education and labor market? So it's good, but it's not necessary. We cannot have solution only with the higher education process, according Bologna process and social engagement.
Okay. Mette, how do we create this bridge in labor market and higher education sector? And if you can connect that to recognition of prior learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy that you mentioned this, because we see in vocational education and training, it's been sort of easier to embrace the idea of recognition of prior learning because you have identified more concrete skill set that you would need to acquire in order to fulfill a certain profession. And higher education qualifications are often meant to to be able to bring you in many different directions. And one thing that we are promoting a lot, also with the renewed agenda that was just adopted the 31st of May, the renewed agenda for higher education, is of course that higher education is relevant for society and the labor market. And linking it to recognition of prior learning. One thing that could also perhaps be a push for trying to think in different ways of recognition is that institutions reward what takes place outside of the institution. This can be done by basing learning on learning outcomes, and again we're back to the ECTS Users Guide, of course. But take, for instance, a semester in a higher education degree and say to the student, you can do volunteering, you can go and be active in your local community, you can do an international internship, whatever. But we will look at your learning afterwards and award you the degrees or the credits that you could have been awarded had you been studying classes for those 6 months. And in that sense, I think that higher education institutions and programs will be more relevant. Plus, it is a way to promote that learning is many things. I know that I'm in the very right country when I say that, but formal learning is not the only valuable learning that you do.
Michal, do you have any comments on the views expressed by the audience?
Well, I was thinking about that. I think one of the drivers is explaining the role of the student, because I think this should be the benefit of the student. Should they be interested in going through the pathway faster? What we can see in a number of countries is probably the burden of the funding mechanism, which basically forces the higher education institutions to keep the students as long as possible because they still get funding for that. So I think that's probably an issue of sort of reviewing that. And then I'm in a difficult situation because I'm representing institutions. When it comes to higher education labor market links, obviously this is something where our type of institutions is much closer to agreeing. Still, I would say we should be careful what sort of messages we get from the labor market and how we see sort of long-term trends. What we want to focus probably much more, and I think it's the the trend, which was to some extent mentioned, is promoting the work-based learning as the part of the higher education concept, sort of letting people go out of the schools, experience the real problems within the field, coming back and recognizing that. But again, another issue is how do we sort of keep the quality of that?
Okay, wait, you will be able to comment on this, but I just want to say that time flies when you're having fun. And you know, in the guidelines for moderators, it says never be late for a coffee break. So you will get the opportunity to comment one more time each, and you can comment on the discussion with the audience we had just now. But I also want you to comment on one more question. And Blazhe, you mentioned before several times the working group 3. It's the working group, the advisory group, with the task to look into the future. So I want to ask you what kind of expectations when it comes to the outcomes of this working group, this advisory group. Mette.
Okay, I will then. I'll just give a general remark. I have to comment on what was mentioned. I have still to meet a higher education institution that has said we have completely collapsed because we have taken in students with a refugee background, or this has not been valuable at all to our institution. We cannot use this for anything. We cannot promote any, bigger policies in our institution. It is not valuable for our students, and no one appreciates it. I have yet to meet that institution. I have to say that nothing is collapsing because of this. I have still to hear that national students feel deeply deprioritized due to taking in students with a refugee background who did not enter perhaps the same way as they did. So I think it is very important that we realize that there is a whole environment that is very positive towards accepting people with a different academic and cultural background than normally, and I don't. I have a very, very difficult time to see how we cannot use this for something positive. Thank you.
Michal, what are your expectations when it comes to coming up with new ideas for the future concerning recognition of prior learning?
Concerning recognition of prior learning. I think it's the issue of recognition of prior learning is one of the important issue, but I think it's very important to look at it also in the context of what institutions are actually allowed to do. In some countries, they are in the position to recognize prior learning without even having a national concept for recognition of prior learning. So it could also depend on the autonomy that is given to the university. The same goes, by the way, when what we discussed before about integrated periods of practical experience, projects, whatsoever into the curriculum. We have countries where the curricula are to a large extent decided in the ministry centrally, so then you, as an institution, you don't have much choice to change that. Yeah?
Yep.
So I think this is something that we have to address collectively to make sure that institutions are able to take up innovative concepts in learning and teaching and also in recognition.
Yes. How about your expectations for the future?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, I've mentioned before the non-implementation advisory group, sorry if I was not clear, which is following the 3 key commitments that were recognized by the advisory group, who will be checked from another group, that the countries will be checked from the other group. And it's interestingly enough that Sweden and ESU are the co-chairs of the working group 3, which are setting the key, setting the future goals of the European of the Bologna and the European higher education area. So it's good that we are. I mean, the question is brought here, and it can be discussed with the participants as well, both with ESU representatives and with Swedish representatives. However, for the future, well, I will first go to the advisory group 3 with the non-implementation and checking the 3 key commitments that were recognized, especially the key commitment 2, which is the that is come to the implementation of the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And from the previous implementation report, we can see that we have the 3 different countries, group of countries in the Lisbon regarding implementation of the Lisbon Recognition Convention. And out of 48 countries, we have only 10 who've fully implemented. So I do believe that before setting future goals, the countries should focus also on implementing something that we already have. Yeah. Due to the fact that 10 countries haven't implemented anything, none of the 3 goals. Of course, setting up in the future goals of Bologna, focusing, emphasizing also part when it comes to recognition of prior learning and also refugees, recognition of refugees status and qualifications should be there on the table and discussed. However, as mentioned before, and I will stick to that due to the fact that we have plenty of documents, plenty of things that we should, documents and implementation report that we should follow, and guidelines that we are lacking behind. And this is one of, because at the end of the day, yes, on the implementation report, every country wants, I'll be 10 seconds, every country wants to be light green or the best color, but that's, I do not believe that that's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal in the implementation report should be the reality and how the country can strive to get to the best results and be fully green.
Okay, Michal, a short comment about the future of recognition of prior learning.
I would like to get coffee as well. I think when I look at Bologna, we sometimes felt like a donkey and a green leaf, like running all the time and not catching that. There was always another goal set. And I think in Yerevan it was the first time when there was discussion should not be focused on implementation. And that would be our point as well as regards the non-implementation working group. There should be some mechanism helping the countries which are lagging behind to catch up. Otherwise, the entire construction is sort of undermined. So we are very much in favor of that. When it comes to recognition of prior learning, I think it should be still raised an issue within the discussion within Bologna to raise the awareness, but it is within the entire probably concept of changing teaching and learning pattern, and I think we should pay attention to that as well, because it's not anymore the chalk and talk. Thank you, and meet you by the coffee.
Thank you, and give your hands for the panel.